Okay, good morning and welcome everyone to this very special edition of the Voices of Video. And I know I introduce every one of our guests every episode as this very special edition, but they really are. We have unique discussions here. We talk to experts from every, you might say, corner of the ecosystem in doing many different things involved in different aspects of delivering video via streaming and OTT technologies. So, in my mind, that makes every session and every guest special. So, welcome. My name is Mark Donegan. I'm joined today with Daniel Silhavy. And Daniel, first of all, welcome and good afternoon. I know you're in Germany right now, right?
Exactly, different time zone, evening for me, morning for you. Yeah, so great to be here.
That's
Thank you for
right.
inviting me and looking forward to the conversation we're gonna have.
Awesome. Yeah, I really am as well. And, I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself. But I thought this episode, we're going to get a little bit deep in some standards and we're going to talk about some technologies that maybe not everyone's familiar with. So let me give a quick roadmap of where we're going and really encourage you, even if 5G and media and some of these technologies and standards don't directly apply to what you're doing, I would definitely stay tuned and definitely listen because they very might will in the near future. So as you're going to learn, but yeah, today we're really going to be diving into open source. What's happening in the open source development community, really within the context of 5G media streaming. So Daniel's going to talk about what he's doing and what the contributors are doing with dash.js. Dash.js, if you're not familiar, is a really essential tool in the media streaming industry, and Daniel's work as well around reference client, developing reference clients for multiple, standards organizations. So he is definitely a standards person. So he's going to be able to share, some unique insights there, and just what's required. And we're going to as well dig into what's happening specifically with the 5G Mag reference tools, and he's going to give some insights in the upcoming face-to-face meeting. It's happening in June in Berlin, and there's a whole lot of other stuff. So, I guess with that, Daniel, why don't you kick it off and give a short intro, quick intro about yourself, and then maybe we'll start the conversation with your Dash.js work.
Sure. Thank you, Mark. So yeah, my name is Daniel Silhavy. I'm working at Fraunhofer Focus in Berlin and I really lost track at some point. I think it's 9 years now. It might be 10 years. You know how it is. Time
Time
flies.
flies.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I'm mainly dealing with media streaming related topics. We're going to talk about Dash.js later. But I'm also active in standardization organizations such as Dash.js, 5G Mac, also active in CTA Wave.
Mm.
And I'm also giving lectures at the Technical University in Berlin, also supervising projects there. And this is maybe also the first takeaway from today. I really try to kind of connect these two things. So not only present the work we are doing, for instance, in Dash.js and 5G Mac to students, make them interested in that, but also supervising projects and kind of take what the students produce in that project and merge it back as an open
Mm.
source software to the technology stack. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, that's a pretty tremendous way to, you might say, grow contributors, right, to these
Exactly.
projects. So, yeah,
Exactly.
thank you, thank you for helping there.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
have to
that's
start
amazing.
young, right?
Yes, exactly. And contributing to open source projects as a young engineer is a wonderful way to
Perfect.
really get your feet wet and
Yeah.
get known in the industry. I
Yeah.
am aware of many developers, many engineers who are able to springboard into jobs at Netflix and
Yeah.
many other really really great companies as a result of being a contributor. So
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it gives you visibility. So if you do like a CV today, you probably put your GitHub account on the CV, maybe even if you have a Stack Overflow account, and then people
yeah,
can see what you did already. I think that's
that's
perfect
right.
advertisement for yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. That's great. Well, where should we start? Do you want to talk about dash.js, or do you want to talk about the 5G
Yeah.
media streaming? Um,
Let's maybe start with Dash.js and then transition
okay.
over to the 5G media streaming because that's a bit more, I want to say, enhanced compared to what we are doing in Dash.js. So I think you gave a perfect introduction already because you mentioned Dash.js and you said Dash.js is a reference client and a very important tool for different SDOs, different standardization organizations. And I completely agree with that. And this is really how Dash.js started off. So I think it's almost like 10 years ago, 11 years ago when we started
Mhm,
Dash.js. And it started off as a reference client for the Dash Industry Forum. So we take the Dash spec, the IOP guidelines from the Dash Industry Forum, and we do some kind of reference implementation of certain
mhm,
features. And then in an ideal world, you have a direct connection between the developers and the people writing the specifications. So you benefit from each other, I want to say, because as a developer, I can go back to the people writing the spec, I can ask questions, I can point out mistakes. And by letting
mhm,
them know what is possible today on the platform, they also might get important feedback on what is really what can be achieved and what are certain limitations. So you have this kind of feedback loop in place, which is great. So that's a
mhm,
perfect working model. But then again, it's not only a reference client. Dash.js is also used productively by, for instance, the BBC, the Deutsche Telekom, by Arte, the French broadcaster. So many companies are actually using this as a reference client and as a production component, so as a
mhm,
foundation for their commercial application. So I think that's important. And the third pillar that I'm always mentioning here is the research community, because a lot of research papers are based on open source software. And Dash.js is
mhm,
one thing that can really where you can inspect the code, you can do your changes. So for instance, if you want to implement a new algorithm to choose the best quality for the player, you can take Dash.js, you can compare it to the existing implementation, and then you can do your own implementation on top of that. So that's
mhm,
perfect, I think.
mhm.
Maybe Mark to also introduce you a bit about the working principles. So the
Yeah.
great thing about Dash.js is also that it's a funded project. So Dash.js is actually spending some money investing to make
Mm,
or to let us do the development, the maintenance, which I think for today's open source community, open source world is not guaranteed. So you hear about many projects being maintained by people in their free time, not getting
yeah.
anything for that. So that's
Yeah.
already very good situation. But then again, we also have contributors from the community. So, for instance, Broadpeak, BBC, Dolby, Orange, Ivan, they all contribute certain features back to Dash.js. And then we're going to
Mhm.
review them, we're going to merge them back, and then everyone benefits from that. So that's perfect, I think.
Yeah, that's amazing. Now, are there some commercial products that are built on top of, Dash.js?
So, for instance, the BBC iPlayer, this is the
Mm,
player they use in production, that's built on
okay.
Dash.js. I'm not sure
Yeah.
actually if they use that on all platforms because Dash.js
Mm,
is a web-based player. You need certain APIs for it to run. But
hmm
basically, if you have a web environment, you're good to go. You can go for
hmm
Dash.js. And then the Deutsche Telekom, probably not known that much in the in the US market, but Magenta TV is an OTT streaming service by the Deutsche Telekom with lots of German customers. So they are also using Dash.js in production. So those
Ah,
are like
interesting.
two names, yeah. And we
Yeah.
also contact with Sky, Sky Europe, who might transition
hmm
to Dash.js, and as I mentioned,
hmm
also the French broadcaster Arte using Dash.js on some of their
Yeah.
platforms.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, some really really good work there. Can you comment about do you have any key features that are
Mhm.
coming or anything on the roadmap that maybe
Yeah.
listeners would like to know about?
I have a long list, and we can actually play
Okay,
a bit of buzzword bingo here. But maybe we pick the important ones or the interesting
that's
ones
right.
for the
Yeah.
community. So in general, in Dash.js, we are working on a new major version, which will be version number 5. And
Okay.
I spend a lot of time making, for instance, the ABR decisioning in the player more robust. Also
Mm,
introducing new APIs coming from the browser to improve the throughput calculation. So this is one
mm,
thing that I was focusing on. And then we have a very specific feature which is called adaptation set switching. And I know, Mark, you're a codec guy.
yeah.
So in the Dash world, you typically have different codecs in your manifest and you structure
Yeah.
them in a way that you have different adaptation sets. And
Yeah.
there's a certain it's called supplemented property that lets the player more or less switch between those different qualities from different adaptation sets. So I can
Mm.
start off with H.264, and if the platform supports that, I can transition to H.265 or vice versa, whatever is smarter.
Amazing. Amazing.
And that's something we were missing so far. So that's also something
Mhm.
we added then in the new version of dash.js. I think it's a
Mm.
key feature, especially if you think about also DRM protecting your content. And I know that
Mhm.
Hollywood studios have a very concrete demand for
Yes.
encrypting your content with a certain security level, especially if you're streaming UHD. So
Yeah.
that's why typically the content provider is encrypting their content with different keys for different, let's say, qualities, SD, HD, and UHD. They all
Hmm.
have different keys. So that's
Yeah.
challenging from a player's perspective. So that was one thing we added. And then maybe also talking about embedded devices and the great contribution coming from an external contributor. So you know that Dash is, the format is XML based.
Yes.
And in some cases, these manifest files can get really large if
Mm-hmm.
you follow a certain signaling pattern for the MIA segments. And this
Mm-hmm.
can actually be a problem on embedded devices because these devices, they take a lot of time to convert this this XML format to a JSON format. I did some
Mm.
tests some years ago and it was up to 2 seconds only for the parsing part.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that's why we
Wow.
choose another XML parser to improve this parsing time, speed this up to not kind of DDoS our own platform, because if you have a
Mhm.
live
Yeah.
stream and you do that manifest refresh every 4 seconds and takes you 2 seconds to only pass the manifest, then
Yeah.
you run into performance issues. So that's
Yes, you do. Yeah. That's interesting. Maybe I was aware of that, but I don't think I was aware of that issue. So that's fascinating. Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
Every once in a while, people are coming up. Oh, why don't we do Dash in JSON format and not in XML format? So that
Yeah.
happens on a regular basis,
Oh,
and
sure, sure, sure. You
yeah.
you have you have an answer for that now.
Yes, and there's a reason to do that really. But yeah, I mean,
Well, what
Dash
is
is
so what is the reason? So why did you
yeah.
choose
So
XML over JSON?
that's a good question. I would have to ask that to the SDO guys. I think it's more
Oh,
or less
okay.
like because it goes really back in time to like 15 years ago, and maybe
Yeah.
XML was the prominent format then. But
Yeah.
web-based clients, they always work with JSON. They don't really
Yeah.
use XML natively, so you always have to do this
Yeah.
conversion.
Yeah, this conversion. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, anything else coming in version 5 that might be of
I have
interest?
more. I have more. As I said, the list is
Okay.
long.
Okay.
So maybe you had heard about two CTA wave standards, common media client data and common media server data. That's
Mhm.
actually useful because the client, for common media client data, the client is sending certain metrics back to, for instance, the CDN. This can be
Mm.
something like my current buffer level, the current quality I'm playing, but also something like this is the segment I'm going to request next. And
Mhm.
based on this information, the CDN can optimize its internal behavior. We have all these edges distributed all over the world, and you don't want to go have the edges go back to the origin for,
Yeah.
let's say, cache misses, right? So if you
Yeah,
signal
sure.
early, this is something I want to request next, and then the edge can check, okay, I don't have this. I have to go back to the origin. It can already
Yeah.
be cached once you do the actual request. So that's really
Yeah.
useful
Yeah.
from a CDN perspective. So there are many more parameters, and actually CMCD is widely supported not only by dash.js, also by other players like HLS.js, Shaka Player, Exo
Mhm.
Player. The only thing missing at this point is native HLS playback. But
Yeah.
I know a little bird whispered. So Apple is actually taking part or taking contributing to CMCD version number 2. So there's a high
Mm.
chance that CMCD will also land in the native HLS clients, and then you have
Mm.
CMCD support on all of your clients on all of the platforms. That would be really great.
Now, a very interesting application for CMCD is if you were firing off really highly efficient, of course, I'm thinking of silicon, right? Where you're doing
Mhm.
edge encoding. If you knew what segment was going to be requested next, then you could encode it on the fly,
Yeah, that sounds also
right?
great. I haven't heard about this use case, but also
Yeah.
sounds like a great use case. Yeah.
Yeah, because because this is one area where this whole idea of the just-in-time, both encoding and packaging. I mean, obviously, just-in-time packaging is what many services are now
Mm-hmm.
effectively doing today. But the encoding part, that even going back 10 years ago or 12, maybe even 15 years ago, but I know when Cisco and others, were talking about this whole concept that you would distribute a MES file across the network. So, and I don't mean literally like an uncompressed, but you would distribute what is effectively, maybe it's your top bitrate profile, for example. And then at the edge, you would simply transcode that into the resolution you want, even the codec and whatever specs you need in real time. And then, of course, it's packaged in real time. Well, the packaging part we're doing now,
Mm-hmm.
but the encoding and kind of that transcode is, we're not doing.
Mm-hmm.
And now, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, it was because the cost was just so high to do that on CPU. ASICs weren't really good enough. There were some, I would say, some very real technical challenges. Now the hardware is caught up, and you could do that even with GPU. Technically, it's much more expensive to do it, but you could do it with GPU, and certainly ASICs really shine there. But that's interesting because you could
Yeah.
signal, and then if you had those files locally available almost in a Netflix Open Connect style, where they're storing literally inside the POP, some portion of their library.
Mm-hmm.
Some very interesting things you can do. So, hey,
Sounds
maybe
really
somebody's
interesting.
building that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
mean, if you have wide player support, also native player support,
Yeah.
then you're good to go more
Yeah.
or less.
Yeah,
No,
exactly. That's,
sounds great.
yeah.
And then maybe corresponding to that, so we talked about CMCD client sending data to a server. There's also
Mhm.
the other way around. So
Yeah.
CMSD coming with their server data. This is
Yeah.
actually data that is also communicated between different CDN nodes, edges. So they use that internally. But there's also an
Mhm.
interesting part from a player's perspective because what the CDN can give me are certain, let's say, recommendations. So for instance, the CDN might tell me, I'm overloaded. I have so many clients.
Mhm.
Please only go to that bitrate and not higher. So it can give me
Mm.
actual bitrate recommendations. And at the same time, and this is really interesting for low latency, it can also estimate the throughput on the server side and then communicate this estimation to the client. And on the client side, you can then use this estimation to choose the best bitrate because you might have information that
Wow.
is not available on the client side.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Wow. So the intent, so the network can inform the player then, so that the player can make more appropriate requests of the network.
Exactly. Exactly.
Wow.
And now, if you combine these two, it gets really interesting, I feel, because if you have the client metrics coming via CMCD and you have the server metrics
Yeah.
coming via CMSD, the
Yeah.
server can kind of also coordinate a lot of clients. So if the
Mhm.
server knows I have 30 clients competing for the available bandwidth and one
Mhm.
client is about to run into an empty buffer, the server can prioritize this client and maybe choose
Mm.
to delay the request or response for the other clients a
Mhm.
bit. And it can also tell the other clients, please stay, as I said, within a certain threshold for your bitrate
Mhm.
to make it like to give a fair amount of the available bandwidth to all of the
Mhm.
clients connected to a certain gateway. So there are different
Mhm.
possibilities here and lots of options, I feel, using this data.
Yeah. Do you think CDNs are going to be incorporating CMSD into, are they going to be using that? Do
Yeah,
you know or
I
have a
think
sense?
so. Yeah, so CMCD is already widely supported by multiple
Yeah.
CDNs. And I know that you had Will Law, for instance, as a guest in one of your previous
Yeah.
episodes. I'm not sure if
Yes.
it was
Yes.
you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, Will is
He
driving
talked to
this.
Jan Ozer. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure if it was Jan or you. But he's driving this from an Akamai point of view. So
Yeah.
Akamai
Yeah.
definitely has support. And I think also other CDN vendors offer support for at least CMCD, and I guess CMSD is about to come, yes.
Is about to come. Yeah,
Yeah,
if a CDN is supporting CMCD, why would they not want to support CMSD? Uh,
exactly.
at
Yeah.
least logically, you would assume that. Wow, that's super cool. Well, what else is on your list?
There's more, there's more. Uh,
The gifts keep coming.
yes. So next thing I wanted to mention is content steering, and we talked about CDNs
Oh
right now, so this
yeah,
fits perfectly
yeah.
in there. So the idea is that typically as a content provider, I offer the same type of content on different CDNs. Simply to avoid outages on one CDN, I can switch over to another CDN. but there might also be situations in which one CDN performs slightly better than the other one for whatever reason. And with content steering, we have a way to steer your clients, Dash and HLS clients actually, in a standardized way between different CDNs. You can tell the client, at this point, please switch to CDN A. And if CDN A is not performing well, you tell them, okay, now switch to CDN B. So the idea is not really new, but I think at this point, it's like the first time that this is standardized. It's coming from an HLS world. But Dash IF has taken the task to also convert that to a Dash specification, and it's right now it's an Etsy specification from what I understand. So you you can implement a single steering server, and you can steer Dash and HLS clients at the same time with the same response, which is great. So it's interoperable. This is what we want in the end. We want to support Dash and HLS, but we want not to duplicate information on the server, right?
Yeah, definitely. Wow. So, I mean, this just wipes out the companies that are out there with solutions and products that basically are doing this, right?
Yeah,
Because why do you need them?
yeah,
I guess
proprietary thing.
maybe in theory, and they would say, oh, but we have additional information or intelligence about about the network that you're not going to get.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, it depends who's integrating the content steering server.
yeah,
But then again, you
yeah,
can also combine this again with CMCD metrics, and then you can
yeah.
do intelligent steering
Super
decisions on
powerful.
the steering server. Yeah.
Wow. That's exciting. I know
Yeah,
there's
that's
a
right.
lot of talk about content, and CDN steering, and I mean at NAB and Mile
Hmm.
High Video and pretty much every conference that's going on. I
Yeah.
know there's a conference now going on in Sweden, or maybe it just wrapped today. I may be off on the dates, but there's
It
been
was today.
papers and presentations. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
Breitkopf, Yuri Resnick, you probably know him.
Yes.
He's driving
Yes.
that
Yuri's
forward.
been. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And they have a really intelligent solution by now, from what I understand, that does these
Yeah.
steering decisions really based on a lot of metrics and then redirects
Yeah.
the client to the best possible
Yeah.
CDN. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I was chatting with Yuri a little bit at NAB, and he they're really developing this
Hmm.
pretty deeply, putting a lot of focus on it. So yeah, fascinating. Okay,
Hmm.
what else?
Some
What else
more,
is
but
coming? Cookies.
maybe one.
Give me cookies.
Maybe Mark, one final comment for content stream, because I think this is also a great example how dash.js can help drive these standards. Because I was in
Mm,
contact with Yuri, and at this point, or at that point when we were talking about it, basically no client was supporting content string. So they had some kind of server-side implementation, but they needed validation, obviously, on the client side. So we
mhm,
took this challenge, we implemented content steering before the specification for Dash was actually out. And then we had this stack working together, this reference implementation, comparing it to the specification, identifying gaps. So I think that that's
mhm,
perfect again for driving these standards forward. You need
mhm.
some kind of reference.
Agreed. Yeah.
Okay, then maybe some other things I also had on in my mind. So there's a new feature in MPEG version 6 of Dash, which is called L3D Dash. Um, the name is not that intuitive, so I think it stands for low latency, low delay extensions. But that's what I found, so I always have to
Yeah.
check this.
Yeah.
Um, and the idea is really that you want to improve the startup time of the player. And again, Mark, you're a codec guy. So usually what you do in Dash and HLS, you have these 2 to 4 second segments, and you have an
Yeah.
IDR frame at the beginning of the segment.
Yes.
And the idea behind LCD Dash is that you have a separate representation where you have a higher cadence of IDR frames. So let's say every 5 frames is an IDR frame. And
Mm.
then at the start, I would choose one segment of this specific representation. I can start immediately with the playback because I have my IDR frame at the position that I want to join in, more or less. And then I switch to the normal representation right after I have played the special segment with the high
Yeah.
cadence of IDR frames. So
Yeah.
that should increase the or improve the playback start by a
Mm.
significant amount of time.
Yeah.
So that's what they specified in the current Dash
Mm.
specification. And this is something that we certainly will also implement in Dash.js at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, um, is there any difficulties? Do decoders? Will some decoders struggle? with this,
Yeah,
or
that's a good question. That's actually, I mean,
have you
I'm
tested, or is that what needs to be done? Some testing there.
that's something that needs to be done. I know that there were some complaints when people did this HASP implementation, which I think works in a similar way. You have
Hmm.
these tracks with
Yeah,
low frequencies of IDR frames, and then you
yeah,
switch towards to a different track. This is
yeah,
really something I need to test. So far,
yeah.
I did some very basic initial tests. So far, this looks good to me. But then
Mm,
again, this maybe leads us also to one thing I also wanted to mention. The testing is really, if you test on the desktop browser on a new MacBook, this behaves differently than if you test it on a setup box or a smart TV. And I,
yes,
I
yes.
always, so testing on setup boxes and smart TVs, I feel the pain. Everyone who's
Yeah.
doing that, my condolences there. So,
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And it feels like anyone who's worked in video for 90 days even um usually comes with this. How come it is so hard to get things working when we're in a nearly 100% standards compliant environment?
yeah,
If you think about it, now the implementations of the standards can vary a little bit, but and certainly, where technologies are used, one service can, but the point is it we are a standards, everything we're doing today, with very, 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 very few exceptions, are all standards compliant. And yet
yeah,
you can have it work perfect on this device, work mostly perfect on this device, and completely fall down on the other.
yeah,
And you're like,
yeah.
and all devices are also, are supposed to support, the codec standards or whatever the technologies are. And anyway, these are some of the reasons.
Completely
But
agree. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But that's really exciting. And I think also in my work, in the ecosystem, there's always just that. And there is no right answer. A platform just has to have a view, or a service has to have a view. Do we leave no viewer behind? To kind of use that analogy, meaning that we can never really support kind of the newest and the latest, and
Mm,
because we have to support all the way back to I don't know, iPhone 8, or iPhone 10 or something, or do we sort of take a middle range view where we say, we want to support 80%, maybe 85% of the addressable market. There's going to be a few users that just aren't, or do we have kind of a bleeding edge? And very, very few people have kind of the bleeding edge where it's like, hey, if you're not running one of the most modern devices, you may not have a good experience. Finding people in general are moving from, um, you know, 8, 10 years ago, pretty much everybody had the we have to support everything mindset.
yeah.
Which meant that, wow, I mean, we were really hamstrung. Now, a lot of services are starting to move into this, probably they want more than 85%, but they're like,
Mm,
okay, let's face it, at some point we have to just sunset and say, sorry, we don't support that original Roku box, for example. Don't support it. Sorry, time to upgrade. It's $29,
yeah.
like,
Completely agree.
so,
And I mean, I feel
so
like
yeah.
sometimes it's even cheaper for the company to send a new
Oh,
device to the customer
yes,
than,
yes.
than to try to debug this device.
Yes, 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 exactly. And then I think what's also helped though this scenario is that the refresh cycle on consumer devices, including TVs, and I'm old enough that when I was a kid, I mean, literally people would replace their TV every maybe 10, 12, maybe even
Mm,
15 years. I mean,
mm,
that was the upgrade cycle, and only if you were just, had money to burn, or just really, really, really an enthusiast did you upgrade maybe every 5 years. Well, now, TV refresh cycles have compressed greatly.
yeah,
So the odds that somebody has a TV in their house, maybe not all their TVs, but at least their primary television that's maybe only 3 or 4 years old, certainly 5 years old or newer, that's really high. And, nowadays, a TV that's 5 years old or newer largely supports many of kind of the newest things that we want to be doing. So that's good news. Second is how many of us are replacing iPhones, or if you're on
Yeah.
Android, replacing your handset, sorry, every year,
Yeah.
certainly every 2 years. So again, you've got that refresh cycle. So I think that really, really helps us, but it's always the perennial challenge in video is the point. Well, let's this is great. Thank you for that. I know there's more you could share, but I want to make sure that we get
That's
into
exactly.
5G media streaming.
Yeah.
So, and I think right now you're spending most of your time working on that, correct?
It's a bit of 50-50 because, and
Okay.
maybe to make the transition here, we are, for instance, also using dash.js in 5G Mac as
Mm,
foundation for playback.
mm,
But maybe to give you a very quick introduction of what 5G Mac is actually doing, because it's kind of similar what we are doing with dash.js and dash.js. It's really an organization which with multiple stakeholders from different, let's say, part of the ecosystem, MNOs, broadcasters, chipset vendors, etc. And they work together on media related topics in 5G, which is a very broad term, I understand.
mhm,
And the work is divided into different working groups, and there's a specific working group doing reference implementations again. So similar
mhm,
to what we are doing with dash.js and dash.af, there's something for that in 5G. But if you talk about 5G media, this is really, there's a lot of stuff you can do. Um,
mhm,
and we definitely don't have the time to cover everything here. But I think what would be interesting for this audience is the 5G media streaming part, because
mhm,
Marco and we quickly talked about that. People have the feeling that, and I understand this, that if you open your phone and you start streaming OTT content via a 5G network, we can call that 5G media streaming. And this is perfectly, legal to say that, and legitimate to say that. Um, but the idea behind 5G media streaming and then looking into the CDPP specifications is really to have a tighter integration of certain functionality into the
mm,
5G system.
mm,
And I always phrase one of my, well, not my colleague, but someone who's actually working at the BBC, who is also contributing heavily to the CDPP standard, Richard Bradbury. He called it a dumb bit pipe once.
mhm,
So you can be smarter when you do 5G media streaming.
mm,
And this is actually what we are working on, and next to other work items in 5G Max. So implement reference tools, reference components for 5G media streaming.
mm.
And what I thought about, Mark, would be interesting to talk about are, let's say, 4 specific use cases of 5G media streaming that we implemented.
Great.
We actually did a release today. So maybe I
All
just
right.
start with that and
Yeah,
let
let's
me
do
know
that.
here.
Let's do that.
Um, so one thing that 5G media streaming offers is something called consumption reporting. So looking a bit again into the CMCD world, but basically you have all these clients connected to a 5G network, and they are reporting what they are streaming. And
Mm,
based on these reports, so for instance, you know that a certain user is consuming a certain content, you can, for
mhm,
instance, start dynamically a 5G broadcast, which leads us to another
mhm,
topic. But just to give you the highlights, if I
mhm,
have, for instance, a cricket game in India and I have multiple million people watching this game at the live
mhm.
edge, why do I want to do unicast and deliver the same content to everyone else individually? So this is
Exactly. Yeah.
what 5G broadcast offers. So you can broadcast your
Mm.
content to devices which don't even need to be connected to a 5G network. They can receive the content also in receive only mode with newest devices.
Amazing.
And they get this content, and then you can enhance that with OTT content or 5G media streaming content. You can say, everyone who's watching the content in English at the live edge, I'm going to broadcast this. But if someone wants to watch the Spanish audio track, they're going to
Mhm,
consume that via OTT, via 5G media streaming.
mhm,
Or if
mhm,
someone watches time shifting, and then where actually people get the dollar signs in their eyes, you can replace your broadcast content again with personalized OTT unicast content. You simply
sure.
fetch your ad segments via the 5G media streaming via OTT, and then you replace the broadcast content that you received. So that's really
Mm.
interesting in my opinion.
Wow. Wow. Let me ask you real quick. At NAB at the streaming summit, I moderated a panel with Edgio and
Hmm.
Sinclair, and we were talking about ATSC3. Obviously, ATSC3, one of the real primary use cases is the broadcast combined with OTT streaming capability, that these distribution, I'll call them streams, but that's not correct, because one is literally broadcast over the air, but
Mm-hmm.
that they're synchronized, and that you also can fluidly move. So in other words, to the user, the whole point is the user doesn't care and shouldn't care if it's coming over the network, if it's being streamed, shouldn't care if it's coming over the antenna. They just know that they're getting this wonderful experience, this great content. um, how maybe you could explain, is this sort of ATSC3 for 5G, mobile networks, or
Yeah.
maybe you could comment on that, if you're familiar with ATSC3 and
Yeah, I have to
some of
say
that
the
capability.
different broadcast standards, ATSC and also 3GPP, I think they are very similar, but they're not completely aligned when it goes into the details.
Yeah,
And I would have to check this
yeah,
myself. I just
yeah,
read a paper about that, but
yeah.
the details.
Interesting.
But maybe to explain this from a technical point of view, because you said something very important. So for the user, he doesn't care where the content is coming from.
That's right.
So,
That's
so
right.
what you do from a technical point of view, you have some kind of gateway on your device, like a local web server. And then
Mm-hmm.
if you consume segments over the air, over 5G
Mm-hmm.
broadcast, you put them to this local web server. And if
Mm-hmm.
the client does a request to this local web server, you check, do I have this content? Don't I
Mm-hmm.
have this content? And if you don't have this content, you go back to the CDN and fetch it. So for the end user, it's not visible if the content was consumed via 5G broadcast or via OTT. You get the best of two worlds,
Mm-hmm.
and you can combine it in a very intelligent way. Also taking
Mm.
into account that maybe at some point, if you move your phone, you're out of the broadcast reception area, so you need to go
Yeah.
back to the CDN and vice versa. So that's really
Sure.
interesting.
Sure. Sure. Wow. Very cool.
And then maybe
Very cool.
to conclude this, Mark, so there are three other items I wanted to quickly mention, but I
Yes,
think we're also
please.
running a bit out of time here.
No, no,
Um,
no. Let's get through them. This is good.
Okay, perfect. So the next thing is metrics reporting. Also very straightforward. Again, a bit related to CMCD, but the
Mhm.
client is reporting metrics back to the 5G system, and from there they can be accessed by the application provider. So you have a tighter integration of these metrics reports, like buffer level, which representation was played. And I know that 3DPP is also looking into, for instance, CMCD to add this to the specification. So they are developing this as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the most important things here are network assistance, which again goes into the direction of a bit CMSD in this case, but the server or the 5G network can again give some recommendations to the client, like estimated throughput, what is the best bitrate to choose based on the current conditions in the 5G system. And then what the client can also do, it can ask for the delivery boost. So if you see on the client side, I'm about to run into an empty buffer, I can ask the 5G network to prioritize me as a client in order to get a higher throughput and to fill my buffer up again. So that's something you don't really get from
Interesting.
doing plain OTT streaming.
Yeah. No. Wow. Very cool.
Yeah, and maybe the final thing, dynamic policies. So that's the fourth feature I was mentioning. So you want to guarantee a certain, let's say, bandwidth reliability, service latency,
Mm-hmm.
and the 5G system can signal that to a client, and then the client can ask for a specific dynamic
Mm-hmm.
policy or a policy, and then
Mm-hmm.
get certain guarantees when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
latency, bandwidth, etc. So
Yeah.
really a tight integration into what a client needs into the 5G system, I want to say.
Yeah. What is there special work needed inside the network to support these features that you're talking about?
Yeah, so there are dedicated components in the 5G system. For instance, like it's called an application function that talks
Okay.
to something called the network exposure function or policy control
Okay.
function. But they
Okay.
are part of the 5G system, 5G stack, and the endpoints are defined. And
Okay.
maybe coming back to the open source implementation, we have
Yeah.
more or less everything implemented in the 5G Make reference tools. And we are
Mm.
using other open source components because the 5G system is so large, you have so many things that you need to do. So for
Oh
instance,
yeah.
for the base station and for the 5G core, we're using existing open source projects like
Mm.
Open5GS, SLS Run,
Mm.
because this is not
Mm.
something we can do on our own.
Mm.
So that's,
So I
yeah.
guess my question, my question, and this would be the question of our listeners, is okay. So I'm a service. I may be a small service. I may be one of the largest in the world. Doesn't really matter. But I'm a service. This sounds wonderful, and I know that I have, a large percentage or meaningful percentage of users on mobile. So wow, Daniel, amazing. I want to implement this. Now, how can I be certain that of all of the networks that my users are traversing, Deutsche Telekom and Orange
Mm,
and all, and Vodafone, and then, US, AT&T and T-Mobile and, Sprint and, Verizon and so on and so forth.
mm.
How can I be certain that this is going to be supported across them all, or at least a meaningful percentage that the users are going to really benefit? Like,
Yeah, that's a
what's
good
the,
question, Mark. And I think we would need to discuss this with an actual MNO because that's the hard
yeah,
part. I mean, we're doing these
yeah,
reference
yeah.
implementations,
Yeah,
but
I
talking,
understand this is not your job to drive
yeah,
this through, but but you must be having some at least aware of conversations with some of
yeah.
these.
To be honest, it's really hard to get to talk to MNOs. So
I
I'm not
know.
doing that personally, but I know
Yeah,
that, for instance, 5G Mac as an organization, they have some MNOs as a member and they talk actively
sure,
to them. And I
sure,
think
sure.
if we have this reference implementation in place based on open source software and uh, like commercial providers see that this is really working, this is something
Yeah,
useful, this is something
yeah,
people want, then they're
yeah,
also going to implement that. But we need to
yeah.
have this reference in place. That's my feeling at least.
Yeah, I understand. And then there's a little bit of, business, good old fashioned business development that has
Sure.
to happen,
Yeah.
where the right people are contacted and there's presentations and yeah. And this is always the rub, if you will, when you're working in site standards, when you're developing these, super exciting capabilities, and then it's like, okay, now we have to get this pushed out into the wild,
Mm,
so that a service could actually take it and use it, rather than an experiment. So
mm.
yeah, I'm very familiar with having to wrestle with with that, but that's a question I knew that some would have, so I wanted to bring that up.
I
Well,
understand that.
Daniel, this thank you so much for giving us the overview of what you've been doing and what's happening in the dash.js side. 5G Mag, really exciting. We actually have a couple questions that have come in. So is it
Hmm.
okay if we? All right.
Sure.
Well,
Sounds good.
well, good. Well, let's jump in here. So let's see. The first one, in no particular order, is okay. So the person says 5G Mag reference tools is a combination of open standards and open source. What are the benefits of that combination to the industry?
Yeah, I think we talked about
That's
this.
actually a
So
good question. Yeah.
yeah, so we touched this at least. So on one
Hmm.
hand, you know that the SDOs are writing the specifications and they think about so many things that you need to take into account, but there are
Yeah.
still always some things that are missing that might even be wrong that are not clear. So I think that's essential that you have these reference tools, that you implement some kind of POC, some kind of reference implementation, to show the industry, okay, this is really working, this is useful, and we talked about this some seconds ago. And
Mm.
if they see that this is working, I think the industry will pick this up at some point. And maybe also to argue from a Dash.js perspective, I talked to Nicola Weil from Elemental some time ago, and he also explicitly said, if we have a working implementation in Dash.js for a certain thing, then we can also take this back to AWS Elemental and implement it on the server side and really make this work for clients. But they need some kind of reference in order to see, okay, this is useful, this works. And I think that's
Yeah.
beneficial for the industry as well.
Yeah.
Not and obviously also the point that I raised at the beginning. So if you have reference tools and they are production ready, use them as a
Yeah.
foundation for your product.
Yeah. 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 100%. Yeah. That's great. So here's another question that came in. So, how much of the 5G Mag is open source?
So the code that 5G Mac is producing, more or less everything is open source. Sometimes we
Mm.
keep certain projects private for some time because we
Mm.
want to check them before making them publicly
Yeah.
available. But in
Sure.
general, we open source everything, and we did it today as an example. Support for metrics reporting and 5G media streaming was released actually today. So we
Hmm.
try to make everything available to the community. And even
Hmm.
if you're not a 5G Mac member, you can take the code. You can even contribute to the code if you sign the CLA. You don't need to join 5G Mac beforehand.
Amazing. Okay, cool. And the last question here is, what are the pros and cons of streaming 2D and volumetric content? Uh, this is sort of interesting via
Yeah.
WebRTC. So we haven't talked
Yeah.
about WebRTC, but
No.
low latency, right? So obviously, in this context, it's probably AR, VR type, type
Mm.
content. So latency matters. So yeah, can you comment on that?
Yeah. Not in detail. I know.
Or
So,
do you have any
WebRTC.
thoughts?
Yeah, I have. So WebRTC gives you low latencies. That's correct. But essentially, WebRTC is a technology stack. So you are limited
Yeah,
in terms of
yeah,
what you can do. Also in
yeah,
terms of ABR, for
yeah,
instance. So I
yeah.
think, at least my opinion is that there's this new activity called Media over Quick, which
Hmm.
also addresses low latency streaming, but gives you more flexibility because you're using the Quick protocol. You're using certain APIs in the browser, like the Web Transport
Hmm.
API. So you have more control over what you are doing using dedicated streams, for instance, to send your data. So that sounds like, at least for me, like the more promising option
Yeah.
because it gives you more flexibility.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, this question was a little bit outside of the scope of what our whole topic and
Still
conversation was,
interesting.
but it came in, so I thought I would pose it. Well, Daniel, wonderful again to talk to you. I know you and I have had a couple opportunities now to do some podcasts and do some interviews. So really, really nice talking with you. Thank you for sharing all your insights.
Thank you, Mark. Maybe final comment from my side. I'm not sure if I
Yeah.
mentioned this, but we have a dash.js face-to-face coming up, co-located with our Media Web Symposium in
Oh,
Berlin.
that's right. Yeah.
So that will be on the 10th of June. Registration is still open. You can do that for free. So if you want to join us in Berlin, feel free to come by.
Awesome.
Would be great to see as many people as
And
possible.
and what's the weather like in June in Berlin? Is it nice?
It's it's hot, yes. So if
Okay.
you are wearing a suit, yeah, you're gonna sweat a bit. No, we have around 30, and that's degrees Celsius. I'm not sure how the conversion to Fahrenheit is. I would
That's a little warm. That's a little warm, but I live in Phoenix, Arizona, so to me, that's a cool spring day.
Yes, you come in your winter jacket, and everyone
That's
else is.
right. That's right. Yeah, it's a little chilly. It's a little cold, but I can handle it. That's funny. Okay. Well, Daniel, thank you again for joining
Thank you, Mark.
us, and thank you to those who joined live. If you're listening or watching on the replay, thank you for listening and watching. All right. Till next time, we'll sign out there.
Thank you all.